Account policies are settings that control how user accounts can be used on your network. For example, you can configure an account policy that requires a complex, long password. Account policies are configured on a domain basis. If you need to have two sets of account policies, some for some users or computers on your network and some for another, you would actually need to create two domains. Now you can create group policy objects and link them to organizational units and configure account policies within those group policy objects, and those would affect the local security accounts on the computers within those organizational units. But to affect account policy across the domain, you need to configure a group policy object that is linked to the domain. Domain controllers ignore, as far as account policy goes, all group policy objects that are not linked to the domain. So let's right-click the domain and select Properties, go to the Group Policy tab, and we're going to configure account policy in the default domain policy. This is usually the place that it's done. We'll edit that group policy object, expand the Windows Settings folder within the Computer Configuration area, Security Settings, and Account Policies. Notice that there are three types of policies: the password policy, account lockout policy, and Kerberos policy, which only appears in a group policy object that is linked to the domain. Kerberos policy configures settings that domain controllers use when granting tickets, but we're going to focus on password and account lockout policy. In password policy, there are a number of settings. Let's just go over each one so you understand what they are. Enforce password history. 24 passwords are remembered by default. You can open this and configure that to a different number. Users will not be able to repeat passwords as long as it's within that remembered list. The maximum password age, by default 42 days. You can configure this so that users will not have to change their password for a longer time or a shorter time. The minimum password age, users have to keep their password by default 1 day. You could change that as well. The minimum password length, by default, is 7 characters. You can require a password that is longer or shorter than that. Password must meet complexity requirements. In Windows 2003, this is important. It's enabled by default. That means by default, when you create initial passwords for user accounts, they need to meet certain requirements such as length. They also need to meet a requirement of using a variety of characters: uppercase, lowercase, symbol characters, numbers. And they also cannot use the username, for example. And the username cannot be part of the password. There's a way to configure, not here but elsewhere, the DLL that is executed to filter passwords to see whether or not they meet complexity requirements. And just something to be aware of. Store passwords using reversible encryption. By default, that's disabled. There are occasions where you need to enable that setting, but just be aware that that actually makes the password stored in a less secure manner. Account lockout policy. Let's suppose you want to prevent users from breaking into your network by trying to log on using a variety of passwords until they find the correct password. Account lockout policy helps prevent this. There are 3 settings that you need to understand. First of all, account lockout threshold. How many logon attempts are you going to allow before you lock that user account out? By default, the account will not lock out, but we could set this to something such as 5. Notice that it's going to suggest and configure default values for the other account lockout settings. We'll go ahead and accept those values, and let's explain them. First of all, account lockout duration. How long is that user account going to be locked out after the user has entered 5 invalid logon attempts? Well, by default, it's 30 minutes. We could actually change this to 0 so that the account is locked out until you go in or another administrator goes in and unlocks it by configuring the user account properties. And reset account lockout counter after. By default, that's 30 minutes. That means that the user can enter 5 invalid logons within 30 minutes, and then the counter will be reset and they can try another 5 times. You might want to set this to something longer, such as 3 hours. This is the setting that discourages hackers because after they've tried a few times, they have to wait quite a number, as long as you set here, until trying again.